Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk to you today about the final literary time period that we're going to be discussing in this course. And that's what's often known as postmodernism. One element of postmodernism that's been also very prominent in literature is postcolonialism. And it's important, whatever your thoughts about both of these ideas, to have at least somewhat of a grasp on what they're talking about and what their claims are so that you can kind of understand what's going on in some of the literature that's been produced well, in the last, say, 50, 60, 70 years or so. So you notice my little subtitle there, quote unquote, challenging the tyranny of meaning. That's one of those kind of buzzwordy sort of sayings that, well, I'm not saying that that's an actual saying, but it sounds like one of those buzzwordy little sayings that sometimes go along with some of these ideas. And anyway, so we'll be talking about that and what these ideas consist of to at least some degree, at least insofar as they have bearing on literature today. All right, so the first question that we might want to raise is, of course, what is postmodernism? And that depends on who you ask. First and foremost, it's a philosophy that doesn't like definitions, or at least firm and unmoving definitions. So defining the very idea itself can be a little interesting, although as we'll see, one of the things that postmodernism is not known for is, in particular, a whole lot of consistency in a lot of things. So anyway, so most basically, postmodernism is in some ways a reaction against at least certain elements of modernism. So we've talked about high modernism, and we talked about kind of the modernist movement in literature. Some really prominent modernist writers would be James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, Marion Moore, the later William Butler Yeats at least, and some others as well. And also those are some of the writers that we talked about. W.H. Auden, all be considered modernists. And modernism was a movement that, was really on both sides of the Atlantic. So you have it in the United States and then in Europe. Of course, as far as English literature is concerned, the most important two areas would be what was at that time the British Empire and the United States. Although there was obviously some written in other places as well in English. But anyway, postmodernism, like I said, is a reaction against at least some elements of modernism. In particular, it rejects this modernist assumption that there is a stable and knowable truth. Now, modernism a lot of times felt like they didn't know what that stable and knowable truth was, and a lot of the modernist project was actually, we need to find what it is, but there was behind that seeking this assumption that there was actually a stable and knowable truth to find. And in many cases, postmodernism just rejects that idea and just says that truth is all kind of contextual, relative, and that you're not going to find this universal, for all times and all places sort of truth. It really holds that truth is dependent on context, that what's true in one place is not in the other, it just depends on context and things like that. Now, of course, pretty much every philosophy idea holds that some truth is context dependent. I am 12 years old is true sometimes for someone who's 12, and later on in their life it won't be true. So, there's a truth that's at least somewhat context dependent. And then finally, but what postmodernism is really notable for is that it tends to really expand that out and have that idea of truth being context dependent plays a much bigger role in postmodernism than it does in some other ideas. And then finally, and this is really key for literature, is this idea of the rejection of master narratives. And we'll talk about what a master narrative is, but basically it's this idea of this central organizing story to a society, if you will. And so that's what we're going to look at next. What are master narratives, and what do we mean by that term? So master narratives are these common myths, stories, frames of reference All cultures have these. In fact, some people would argue the idea of there being a culture, like this culture or that culture, whether national or ethnic or anything like that, or religious, depends on some sort of a central master narrative that makes a culture a culture. They tend to provide order, coherence, and meaning. So, I mean, think of a good example like the idea of the American dream. If you work hard and are honest and you strive to better yourself and are innovative, then you can make a better life for yourself. Okay, that can be a very powerful story. It can be a very motivating story that has no doubt in many ways enabled and encouraged a lot of people to succeed and make improvements in their life that they might not have already. But I think we all know that there are some people that, that might not work for. Like say, they have a really severe issue that makes it where, well, they're probably not going to ever be the great big economic or political or social success. And so this is where, according to like postmodern thinking, this is where master narratives can go wrong and really cause a lot of problems. So their argument is basically what that tells those group of people that can't, for whatever reason, succeed is the American dream tells them they're losers. Because if the story says if you do A, B, and C, this will result. This isn't resulting, so therefore I must be A, lazy, B, not smart, C, not virtuous, or something like that. Now, I think most of us, when we're really confronted with that straight up, we would say that, well, no, we don't necessarily think that. But if you're in that situation, it can certainly be an assumption, and it can certainly be kind of a go-to assumption for a lot of people. So postmodernism sees these master narratives, like say the American dream or something, as inherently limiting and oppressive. Now, of course, the question then becomes, is postmodernism then really just kind of become its own narrative? And I think you can make some arguments that it is. But then anyway, postmodernism, I'll just kind of go ahead and tip my hand here. I'm not a huge fan of it personally, but I think it is important to understand. I think that, my personal take is that postmodern thought, like a lot of other systems of thought, can be really good at pointing out errors and problems and limitations in some kinds of thought, but I don't think it's a great system, has a great system to replace those systems that it critiques. And that's just my take on it. Take it for what it's worth. However, postmodernism, like I said, does occasionally make some good critiques that sometimes we can get so caught up in these stories, these big master narratives, that we don't realize how we're sidelining people, maybe whole groups, maybe individuals, that sort of thing. So modernism kind of tended to, even if they didn't know what this center was, you see kind of a modernism oval right here, even if they weren't sure what this master narrative or central truth was, modernism tended to think that there was one. We just need to find it. And if the old one was breaking down, then we needed to kind of find a new center to kind of orient society around. Postmodernism says there never was any center. It was nothing but an illusion created by powerful people. And so it's always been multiple competing ideas of truth, and there isn't really some stable central idea that connects it all. So yeah, that's that's kind of where one of the main ways that they come into conflict. So then next we ought to ask, what are the implications of postmodernism? You see right up here, we've got a scene from kind of a famous scene from The Matrix, because as we'll get into a little bit later, The Matrix is a very, very postmodern movie in many ways. Kind of this idea of, what you think is true and the narrative you've been fed is not true, and we're going to resist that narrative, and all that kind of stuff. So some of the implications of postmodernism is that one idea of meaning always just leads to another idea. it doesn't lead to some stable central truth. It just leads to one other idea, and that idea in and of itself is contingent and partial and not complete. It also tends to lead to, in literature at least, celebration of out of the mainstream narrative. So that's where you get all this stuff like, oh, we need to celebrate authors from this cultural group or this particular lifestyle preference or something of that sort. And because it's this idea that, we're going to decenter and we're going to sort of delegitimize these central and seemingly mainstream narratives in favor of these more marginalized ones. Continual undermining of meaning, this idea that anytime you're sure this is the case, we're going to go throw some rocks at that and show the holes in it and how it doesn't quite fit. So it's kind of got this very skeptical sense to it, if you will. It's also this idea that there is no real stable self. Okay, so the modernist literature, one of the really common tropes that you find in modernist literature is this individual who's in a confusing world that searches for who their true self is. And then, through this long travail, they eventually find it, and it's kind of this glorious moment. So you think of, kind of Portrait of the Artist, when he finds out that he's supposed to be an artist, and that's like his core value, who he's really supposed to be. He sort of discovers his purpose in life, and it's all glorious, and he's walking on the seashore and seeing this, girl that looks like a bird, and his soul is taking flight and all this kind of stuff. Well, the postmodernists argue that there isn't really a self, that it's kind of, and I think I'm quoting, I've never actually seen Shrek before, but I think it's, as I understand, this is something that shows up there. It's this idea that when you peel an onion, the self is like an onion. You just keep peeling over layer or layer, and all it is layers. There is no like interior real self behind all the layers. It's just one, projection or invention after another. There's nothing underneath them ultimately. So some people find that pretty liberating because they're like, oh, well, there's nothing that I have to be because there's no core me. I can kind of be whatever I want. I just redefine myself however I please. Of course, the other side of that is there's no real self for any of it to mean anything for, because it's all just masks. Behind the mask is nothing but another mask, and that sort of thing. And this really ties to, and in many ways flows from, this idea called post-structuralism, which is a theory of language and communication, which we're going to kind of watch a short video on next that sort of explains what that is. This is from YouTube. All right, so I'm sure we all completely understood that. To be honest, I've seen that video a few times, and it's still sometimes I feel like I'm not quite getting some elements of it. So don't feel too alone if you're in that same category. But you can see that idea of sort of slipperiness of meaning, and what I was mentioning earlier, this idea of in postmodernism, post-structuralism, of just one idea of meaning kind of leading to another, not really to a stable, knowable truth. The idea being that we can just know more about we just kind of know about thoughts and not really thoughts about real things, so to speak. Anyway, so where do we see these ideas of postmodernism, post-structuralism, etc.? And we'll get into postcolonialism later. Well, kind of everywhere. We see them in movies, books, music, rhetoric, everyday speech. Although I have noticed a bit of a shift in rhetoric where there's less of the kind of postmodern type of language going on in, say, the last 10 years or so. Some people would argue that means that we're kind of moving out of postmodernism and all in some ways, and I think that's probably to some extent the case. So like some phrases though that are in their own way very postmodern is, well, that's just your opinion. Now, obviously, there are things that we do recognize as opinion versus fact and things like that. But if we just dismiss things just as opinion, then we're actually being kind of postmodern if we just dismiss any argument someone makes as opinion, because that seems to hold a presupposition that there isn't really any stable truth to be gotten at by argument, just one opinion versus another. and not really any stable truth behind it. Other people think differently. You know, the postmodernist would use that as kind of a close to an argument, just as a way to shut down an argument, to say, well, okay, well, you think that way, other people think differently. A non-postmodernist would probably say, well, other people can be wrong, you know, because it has the idea, because there's behind that the idea that there's right ways and wrong ways, whereas postmodernist would, well, I'm not going to say like broad brush, but many postmodernists, the really thoroughgoing sort, would kind of argue against there being really right or wrong opinion, just kind of one versus another in some ways. All right, so of course, you know, the whole all truth is relative, with a little caveat, except this statement. We see some of the ways that postmodernism kind of undermines its own project. I love Calvin's little definition of postmodernism here. What important event took place on December 16th, 1773? Well, obviously Calvin hasn't done his homework, so he doesn't know. So he responds to the postmodernist response. I do not believe in linear time. There is no past and future. All is one in existence, and the temporal sense is illusory. This question, therefore, is meaningless and impossible to answer. And his response, when in doubt, deny all terms and definitions. And that's a very postmodernist argument he's making there in his own way. All right, so continuing on, we'll talk about some places, some specific examples of postmodernism in media of various sorts. So some postmodern movies, Pulp Fiction, in its whole kind of non-linear timeline, sort of calling attention to itself as being not realistic. You know, like the violence is obviously kind of slapstick over the top. And you get the idea that these people are performing for a camera and that sort of thing. And, you know, that you're not really seeing, it's kind of doing away with realism in place of this just kind of, okay, we're doing our own sort of putting on this deliberate play about it. And yeah, all that's very postmodern. Monty Python, The Holy Grail. Oh yeah, you know, the whole, we're pretending that these guys are really knights and kings, but they're running around clapping coconuts together and making jokes and stuff that are obviously not historically anything that anyone in the medieval era would have said. And then, you know, we have him actually getting arrested by the police, showing that the whole thing is very obviously kind of a construct and not reality. Fight Club, the whole, you know, uncertainty of self, and self is just a performance, so much so that, well, if you haven't seen it, I won't spoil it for you too much, but some people might not really exist, and that sort of thing. And then the whole end where all the structures of meaning in society come raining down. I already mentioned The Matrix, but The Matrix is very postmodern in many, many ways. This idea that what you think you know, the truth that you thought, is all undermined and it might be a lie, and that there's another layer, and then, you know, is that just a layer itself of reality? Is there another layer beyond that? And all this kind of stuff, and, you know, the whole, you know, resisting what you think reality tells you based on your own sort of internal wants and senses and stuff like that. So all that's very postmodern. All right, some postmodern books. Catch-22, it's a very dark comedy about World War II, where this guy, you know, the catch-22 is that the only way that they'll let you out of being a bombardier in World War II is if you're crazy, but the only people but if you want to get out of being a bombardier, that's proof that you're sane, because only someone who's actually crazy would want to continue with that. So it's kind of a catch-22. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. I've mentioned that a couple times, but it's this takeoff on Rosencrantz and Guildenstern from Hamlet. And they sort of realize that they're not main characters, and so they realize they're somehow in a story that maybe isn't their story, and they're sort of trying to discover themselves to an extent, but kind of coming up against all these weird things, like they flip a coin several hundred times and it always comes up heads, and all these other wacky sort of things. Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. This is one I've actually not read, but it is widely considered, it's generally considered a postmodern book. I do know that the gravity's rainbow is a reference to the arc that a nuclear warhead makes when it's launched and falls to its target. Yeah. Waiting for Godot is another play that's kind of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, somewhat absurdist and stuff. So it's these two bums named Vladimir and Estragon who just basically sit at this crossroads waiting for this guy named Godot who never shows up. There's just like random stuff that happens, and it's just, and this one dude comes out and like says a page full of absolute nonsense, and that's kind of the story. It's sort of poking fun at, oh, you think that stories are supposed to have coherent narratives to a certain extent, and it's like it's poking fun at the idea of like story structure and things like that. Infinite Jest is another one I have not read before, but yeah, it's, I mean, I've read a little bit about it, and it's definitely postmodern in a lot of ways. Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. It starts, like the beginning of each section starts with a stuff from this Dick and Jane novels. These are Dick and Jane books. These are these readers that people would use like in the 20th century, earlier in the 20th century, to learn how to read. And, there's all of this kind of nice suburban white family with, mom and dad and a boy and girl, Dick and Jane, with a dog and stuff like that. And it's just all this nice little house, and they have all this sort of thing. And so each of these sections starts with that, but then that little passage kind of breaks down into nonsense. And it's a story about a little black girl who, let's just say, very much does not live a Dick and Jane perfect suburban life. It's like some really awful stuff happens to her. And because she doesn't fit into the mainstream narrative in reality, she eventually goes mad. And yeah, so it's a good book. It's very interesting. And Cormac McCarthy's The Road, quite literally, all the reference of society are destroyed. There's some sort of catastrophe. This is like the darkest post-apocalyptic book ever, in my opinion. I mean, there's not even plants alive. There's just like a dad and his son walking down this deserted road, and most of the people they run into are cannibals, and it's really dark. And they find that, and the father finds that like most of his ideas of meaning have broken down because there's no reference to them anymore hanging around, and so he's just kind of left in this soup of uncertainty and things like that. And it's really dark. It's a very well written book. I highly recommend it, but it is really dark. So, all right. So finally, we're going to transition to talking about one of the more influential elements of postmodernism as far as literature is concerned, and one that'll have some bearing on the final book we're going to read as a class, and that is postcolonialism. So, what is postcolonialism? Well, according to Iveson, and you'll see the reference to that in the final slide here, it is a project to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. So you know that old idea of the master narrative sometimes being oppressive, that postmodernism, well, postcolonialism deals with that as far as how it worked in a colonial setting, like a colonizing power, say the British come over, take parts of Western Africa, so to speak. They teach the people there English, they stick them in schools, teach them how to behave like English people, and go to school and go to church and stuff like that. And it's kind of, how do people in that situation negotiate that? What parts do they retain of this new culture? What parts do they resist? How do they react to being seen as kind of a second-rate and lesser culture? That sort of thing, a lot of that sort of stuff. And so when we're applying it to literature and criticism, it really refers to stuff that is written by either colonizing or colonized peoples. So you get kind of both perspectives would sort of fall into this purview. Examining power relationships, like this idea, a lot of times really subtle ones, like, okay, well, we're all going to wear these collars of this particular type. Why? Well, because that's British culture, and so that's proper. And so just kind of that little assumption or thing and things like that. Scrutinize the formation of dual or complex personal corporate identities in a colonial situation. So you have like a lot of people in this situation that, they would behave very British in one way, and then they'd behave and function in a very like say an Igbo way. Let's say if they're a member of the Igbo tribe in what's today Nigeria, and so they kind of need to be able to do that code switching and switch from one sort of situation to another. And I mean, everybody does that. Everybody has a complex identity that they sort of switch from one side to the other on in different situations. But post-colonialism just really, in many ways, emphasizes that sort of dual or multiple sort of identities based on different situations, because it's dealing with kind of this interaction between these very different cultures that quite often have a very unequal power balance between them. And then finally, valorizes, that means like glorifies or praises contributions of individuals from these marginalized groups. So groups that are maybe don't have as much power, literature they write, stuff that's kind of, really tried, post-colonial critics really try to push that to the fore, if you will. So a little bit of background of post-colonialism. Well, I mean, keep in mind that in the 19th and 20th centuries, I mean, a lot of colonial stuff goes back all the way before that. I mean, if you want to look at world history, it's one series of colonizing groups after another. I mean, it's just, yeah, that's been the case all through there, if you will. But most recently, it's been talking about, how Western cultures in many ways have colonized and influenced other parts of the world. So keep in mind that why this has become, kind of a big thing, if you will, in a lot of the world is because, well, Western cultures coming out of Europe have at some point in time controlled basically all of the world outside of, say, China, Iran, a little bit of Arabia, and Thailand, and Thailand. Yeah, pretty much every other part of the world has been conquered or ruled by a Western nation. And even a lot of those, I mean, China was just about broken up. It came under very deep Western influence at one point. Thailand really only stayed nominally independent because it was between French and British Southeast Asia, and they both realized that, hey, it'd be good to have a neutral power between us so that we don't end up fighting each other. And Saudi Arabia, it was colonized by the Ottoman Turks to a certain extent too. So, I mean, it's kind of, in some ways, every part of the world was deeply influenced by Western ideas and ideologies and stuff like that. The relationship between the colonizers and colonized, I mean, that's just kind of the way that colonialism tends to work. It's unequal, that the colonizing group comes in and they tend to feel that at least some elements of their culture are superior. They tend to, show up and bring their culture with them, and to some extent, and with varying levels, sometimes more peaceably, sometimes not so peaceably, there's the interaction between these other groups that were there already and these new groups that are showing up. Native cultures, languages, and ideals often relegated to second-class status. So it's this idea, sometimes they might like make a museum or collect African art or something like that, but it's certainly seen as kind of almost like a curious sideshow as opposed to, whereas, say the British culture is the main show sort of thing. And a lot of times economic inequalities and outright exploitation. So you have varying levels of this. You have some colonies where, the colonial hand is pretty light, and, they're just building hospitals and schools and maybe bringing in some of their ideas of law and justice and stuff like that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got stuff like Leopold's Congo, which was run by the King of Belgium, King Leopold, and it was utterly brutal. I mean, you go read about it, it'll turn your stomach. Some of the things that his colonial officers did in what became known as the Congo Free State, or Belgian Congo, is pretty evil. I mean, he'd chop people's hands off if they didn't produce enough rubber, and like literally millions of people died. Some people think he may have been responsible for as many deaths as Hitler. I mean, it's that bad. And he basically ruined a large area in what's today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly known as Zaire, and some other areas around there. So much so that, and at least in part because of that, they've been in a civil war for like 50 years. They say is the most deadly war since World War II. So it's yeah, some pretty awful stuff took place there. But then you had other colonies that were much lighter touch, and you had some things that a lot of the natives of the area thought were positives, and then you had this stuff that they didn't like so much, and you had some that thought this was good. Some of the natives might have thought this was good, and others didn't, and so you have all these varying responses of these interactions between cultures. Particularly starting the later half of the 1800s and going into the 20th century, racism became a large element in a lot of colonial enterprises. Now, you had differing levels of that as well. You had kind of the paternalistic, well, these are lesser races, but we're going to bring them along and educate them and help elevate them. And then, of course, you have like the straight up Nazi stuff, like, oh, those aren't even really seen as full people. We're just going to butcher them or use them however we want, and we can because we're better than them. And you have, varying levels of that sort of thing. But racism of some sort was pretty ubiquitous up until, well, World War II in many ways, from like the mid 1800s on. I mean, you had it before then, but it wasn't as justified or as regularized until, say, the mid 1800s. And other types of pseudosciences and such that were very common and very popular then. Some important concepts of postcolonialism is this idea of the subaltern. So this person from a culture that's seen as or stigmatized as lesser, and kind of how they form an identity when they feel like, when they're being told by people that their culture is lesser. Do they resist? Do they say, no, it's not. My culture is great. My culture is amazing. Or do they tend to kind of adopt parts of it and say, okay, yeah, well, we need to become more like these colonizers because we're kind of really backwards. And any levels in between there. And so this sort of interaction that happens. Once again, the master narrative idea that, okay, this is the proper way to be, and your old pre-colonial ways are just backwards or something. So stereotypes. So you have like these ideas where, oh, okay, all this group of people are like this. They are lazy, or they're tricky, or they'll never tell the truth to you and stuff like that. And so, kind of, stigmatizing large groups of people by kind of painting with a broad brush. The other. So the other is a really important concept in culture, and also, sorry though, in sociology and things like that. But it shows up in literature a lot too. And the other is basically a way of defining a group by how they're different than our group. Okay. Now, sometimes that's actually done in what would seem to be a positive way, like, the Romans, when they would look at, a lot of times, we think of the Romans that they always looked at the barbarians as, oh, those backwards weirdo savages that do, creepy stuff. But a lot of the Roman writers that actually write about the barbarians is like, oh yeah, they're really strong and they're really manly, and they're not all corrupt like we are. And so, people there are way more truthful than us and stuff like that. But either way, they're kind of like creating this group of, this idea of this different culture as being not like us. And they're defining themselves by how we're not like them, and them as how they're not like us. And both of those are what we call othering to a certain extent. The formation of complex identity. I've talked about this some already, but this idea of, that there's this way to sort of be, say, a British person, but also a member of the Igbo tribe, or a British person and a colonial and a member of the Brahmin caste, say in India. And so where you're getting kind of this mix and sort of mix and match elements, and sometimes outright defiance, sometimes outright adoption, but more often, like wholesale adoption, but more often than not, kind of a middle way where they're pulling elements of both and sort of forming this complicated mixed identity. And then also the cultural identity of the marginalized is an important concept. So, okay, what does it mean to be Nigerian, so to speak? And you notice I keep talking about Nigeria and Nigerians and the Igbo tribe and stuff like that because that's pretty prominent in the book we're going to be reading. And so we'll talk a little bit about the author of that book now. So the author of the book we'll be reading towards the end of this year is Chinua Achebe. He was born in what's today Nigeria. It was back then a British colony in 1930. And he was from the Igbo tribe, which was one of the wealthier at that time tribes, and also one of those that adapted more to British culture when it first arrived than some of the others around. He attended a number of colonial schools, which were mostly run by missionaries at that time, and honestly, a lot of them still are in Africa. And all the way through, he became, he eventually went to university and became a pretty educated guy. He publishes the book we're going to be reading, Things Fall Apart, in 1958. And he went on to write a number of other books after that. Nigeria gains its independence shortly after its publication in 1960, but not long after that, Nigeria is plunged into a very, very brutal civil war from 1967 to 1970. And the Igbo tribe, of which Achebe was a member, were kind of the prime movers of a separatist, one of the main tribes that was kind of behind a separatist movement to form this new nation called Biafra, which was like I think, eastern third or so of what's today Nigeria. And he supported the Biafrans. In fact, I think he was like officially a minister in their government at one point, and they lost. So the Nigerian government rather brutally suppressed the rebellion, and he had to flee to America for a while. Eventually, he was able to come back to Nigeria, but he would spend part of his time in Nigeria and part of his time in America. And so, kind of formed a little, I guess you could say, sort of a dual identity there as well. And he eventually died in Boston in 2013. I think he lectured at Harvard. I don't know if he was officially a professor there, but he did some lecturing there and such. So, all right. So now a little bit about his book, Things Fall Apart. It was written specifically in response to Joseph Conrad's novella, Heart of Darkness, although, somewhat in response to other novels as well. So according to Achebe, he said that Heart of Darkness, which did not definitely, by no means, portray the colonizing, British and other groups and Belgians, because it was set in Belgian Congo, as a good thing to do or good people. But he argued that even in doing that, it still portrayed the Africans as these scary others, that they're like these scary drums on the sides of the river, and that it's this heart of darkness and barbarism in the middle of Africa. And his argument, Conrad, was pointing out that Britain was just as dark and barbarous, but Achebe reads that and he says, those dark, barbarous people playing drums, that was my ancestors. So let's go ahead and look at it from their point of view, and maybe we'll find out it wasn't quite as creepy and barbarous as you'd think. And so he tells the story of what it's like to be colonized from the inside. One of the things I like about this book is it doesn't just tell the simple story that colonizers bad, Africans good. There's a lot of things that you read in there and you're like, wow, that native tradition, that I'm not really sad to see that one go. Okay, and then some of the early missionaries that show up are actually very kind and decent people, but there's some inevitable clashes. And in particular, it's the story of a prominent tribal leader who finds out that in this new world of colonial powers, he doesn't fit anymore. And the same things that made him great in the old world really don't work in this new world. And so it's this story of kind of this clash of cultures and stuff. And he really just shows the humanity and individualism of all those who are kind of depicted as like the sidelights in most of the stories at the time written. And it's a very interesting and well-written story. I think you'll like it. It's actually a pretty easy read too. So after reading Portrait of the Artist, I think you'll be very happy to read Things Fall Apart, and you'll find it a much easier read overall. All right, so that's that. Here's some of my bibliographic sources. This is kind of Achebe's talk about how he got his ideas from Heart of Darkness, and of course the book itself. I used Iveson's description of postcolonialism from Britannica, and then Edward Said. I didn't mention him earlier, but he was a picture a little bit. He's kind of the guy who, in many ways, the theorist behind a lot of the ideas of postcolonialism and stuff like that, who originated a lot of these. And that's it, folks. You have a wonderful day, and I'll see you at the quiz.